2020 has been an incredibly rough year for all of us for various reasons, but let's not dwell too much on all of that because you're here for one reason, to hear my picks for the top 10 video games of the year. This marks the first time where I primarily played games actually released in the current year, partially because there were a bunch of titles that I was excited to try, and partially because of this channel. And while there were some stinkers, there were plenty that I enjoyed and some that I even loved, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Today I'm counting down my top 10 games of 2020. Now, before we get to the list, let's go over the rules. 1. No DLC or expansion packs even if they're standalone, so even if I liked Superhot Mind Control Delete, which I don't, it wouldn't count. 2. I'm not counting ports, re-releases, or remasters, but remakes are fair game so long as they're either built from the ground up or change the experience significantly from the original. So, while Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2 are the best versions of those games, and you should absolutely play them, they are not eligible for this list. Conversely, Final Fantasy VII Remake would be eligible because it's an entirely different game, but that's not on the list either because of my third rule. Every game on this list needs to be one that I've played and beaten. I know that seems kind of obvious, but I'm not going to award a slot to a game if I haven't played it, no matter how much I want to. That means a lot of games you've played that I haven't won't be featured here, and if I don't mention a game you loved, it's likely because I haven't played it yet and not because I didn't like it. And 4, this list is my own opinion, and if you don't agree with it, that's absolutely fine, and if you refuse to be civil about it, then take it elsewhere. That said, I am curious what some of your favorite games of 2020 are, so drop a comment telling me what games you enjoyed playing this year, and I'd love to hear any recommendations of titles you think I'd like. With all that out of the way, let's get to the list. First things first, I do have a few honorable mentions to shout out as members of the Just Missed the Top 10 club. Streets of Rage 4 is a perfect example of taking the best traits of retro and modern games and combining them into a title that delivers a challenging, occasionally frustrating, yet fun and engaging time. Similarly, Maneater takes simple gameplay and crafts a high-octane and thrilling, if somewhat mindless, game that's perfect if you need something to help get your aggressions out or something that's just brain-dead fun. For multiplayer games, Fall Guys takes the win, as not only is it the one battle royale game I've ever been remotely excited about, but most of the mini-games are well made and the additional content like costumes and gestures are addictingly adorable. Finally, there's Cyberpunk 2077, which I'm not even sure if I enjoyed or not, but which I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on. But honestly, I'd rather save that for a retrospective, so come back in 2025, I guess. And now, my top 10 games of 2020. We begin our list with a charming little title by Hello Games, the developers of No Man's Sky, The Last Campfire. If the studio who made it is already turning you away, then I implore you not to judge this game too soon, because it is quite the hidden gem. The Last Campfire is a much smaller game, emphasizing a simple gameplay loop and a more rigid structure than No Man's Sky, not to mention that it doesn't take nearly as long to complete, even if you're going for 100%. The game focuses on exploration and puzzle solving in a world that contains visually distinct areas and a number of characters to interact with, making the world you're traveling in feel like a living, breathing place. Puzzles challenge you in numerous ways, testing both your mental acuity and your physical dexterity, and you never really know what kind of obstacle you'll have to deal with until you come across it. And since you solve puzzles to save lost souls and open up new areas of the world, you have to constantly keep your mind focused on everything around you and notice subtle hints in the world that indicate your goal. But the aspect of The Last Campfire that appealed to me the most is its atmosphere and tone, as it masterfully balances gentleness and terror through its narrative and the characters you meet. It's not so much about the destination in Last Campfire, but rather the journey you experience along the way, as you guide lost souls who aren't quite ready to move on through the realm of the dead. The story features ruminations on life and death and where your soul goes when you pass on, and it captures the wide range of emotions that people have towards dying, complemented by the soothing narration by Rachel August. You see the fear, anxiety, and denial brewing in the souls of those who can't or won't move on to the next part of the afterlife, but also the reluctant yet calm and collected acceptance when they finally find the strength to do so. What begins as a simple puzzle game quickly becomes a philosophical adventure that beautifully examines the nature of death without dipping too far into a depressing note. It's amazing how such a small game can have a big impact, and while it is very short, hence why it's lower on this list, it's constantly piquing your interest and tugging at your emotions all the way through.
This was not how Embo had imagined the end.
Up next is Mafia Definitive Edition. I never played the original Mafia, but I really don't think there's a need to anymore since this version provides the same gripping storyline with gameplay that is much smoother overall. The mechanics are simple since most of what you do is walking, driving, and shooting, all of which you've seen before in open world sandbox games like those that the original Mafia helped codify back in 2002. Mafia Definitive Edition is not the best example of any of these elements, and if you're just looking at the game on its surface, you may see the gameplay and view it as outdated and straightforward to a fault. And that somewhat rings true. You shouldn't expect to go into this title and expect anything innovative, especially since it's adapting the mission structure of a game that's 18 years old at this point. But that's not the reason why Mafia Definitive Edition is on this list, because if I was just judging it on its gameplay, it would never be a contender for the top 10. No, instead it's the story and characters that hook you in and keep you interested throughout the adventure. Of course, it is adapting the storyline of the original game, but what's impressive is how well the new game translates the original plot while occasionally changing things up to give us a new perspective. Small plot details are altered to slightly mix up the relationships between the characters, and while the story mostly unfolds in the same way, the minor changes paint the narrative in a different light. I don't want to spoil anything, even if the story is nearly 20 years old, but a major plot reveal towards the end of the game in particular leads to a different take on the finale, and one that I believe is ultimately better. And even something as subtle as Tommy's line delivery and facial expressions in his final scene, even if it's changed from the original, does wonders in selling the new version of the narrative. This is a game that any fan of well-done cinematic video game narratives needs to check out, and I commend the developers for sticking just true enough to the source material while knowing when to step away from it. The changes the remake puts in place are done with respect for the 2002 classic and help tell the story in the best way possible, and it works so well that the definitive edition in the game's title is certainly appropriate. When I played Resident Evil 2 Remake for the first time in 2020, I absolutely adored it. While horror games usually don't appeal to me, this one was so good that I enjoyed every minute of it during my first, second, third, and fourth playthrough, the latter two of which I streamed live on Twitch. You should subscribe if you haven't already. So, of course I had to jump on Resident Evil 3's remake as soon as I finished it, and it isn't as good as RE2 Remake, but it is still very, very enjoyable. Obviously, the main problem is that RE3 Remake is very short, only lasting for a couple of hours, but if you're like me and you love the formula of RE2 Remake so much, this isn't too much of an issue. Plus, there are a number of gameplay improvements over the previous remake that help RE3 differentiate itself. The dodge is so satisfying to pull off, and it goes perfectly with the game's focus on action over pure survival horror, and the fact that the knife doesn't break means you're always ready for short-range or non-critical encounters. On that note, as the game emphasizes thrills and action more so than RE2 Remake did, it creates a different kind of atmosphere and tone that is a welcome change from the previous game. Even though Jill and Carlos are more than able to stand their own, they're often in open city streets where it's possible to get absolutely swarmed by zombies, forcing you to keep an eye on your surroundings at all times. And don't get me started on the Hunter betas, who are absolutely brutal and beat me hard in the hospital, but are so rewarding to kill because of it. The Nemesis fights are awesome though, since they revolve not just around surviving attacks and blasting the boss full of ammo, but figuring out how to hurt him and taking advantage when he makes himself vulnerable. Now I realize I'm kind of the perfect audience for this game, and what I mean by that is that I can overlook a lot of things that others criticize it for. I knew the game would be short going in, I got the game when it was on sale, and I haven't played the original, so all the missing content from that version doesn't bother me. So my opinion may not be a popular one, but I do genuinely feel that this is a quality title, not on the level of RE2 Remake, and I'd recommend that title over this one any day, but still a frighteningly good game. I'll admit I had a negative bias against Coffee Talk from the start because it's very similar to Valhalla, one of my favorite indie games of all time. Seeing how Coffee Talk adopts Valhalla's drink-serving visual novel gameplay and puts it in a new setting, almost to the point of being derivative, I was curious to see if it could rise above this association. I'm happy to say that Coffee Talk assuaged all my concerns and presented me with a relaxing, soothing, and occasionally emotional experience. Coffee Talk is all about the interactions you have with your customers, because while getting drink orders correct is invigorating and helps boost your relationship with the characters, it's talking to those characters that becomes the heart of the game. Over the span of 2 weeks, you meet a host of unique creatures who either already are or who become regular patrons of your coffee shop. Listening to their requests and the exchanges between people in the shop is critical for figuring out what they want to drink when they aren't asking for anything specific, because doing so will reveal subtle clues as to what they prefer drinking and what they secretly need to drink. And you'll want to make your customers happy because it makes witnessing their stories all the more satisfying. The key word there is witnessing, because what separates Coffee Talk from other visual novels is that you aren't directly making choices through the dialogue that influence a character's progression. All you can do to help them is give them the drinks they want or need. In many ways, this makes you an observer to these characters rather than someone who has a direct impact, but the thing is, you leave a huge impact. You're making these people feel happy and welcome in your shop. It may be a temporary thing, but sometimes that's what you need to get through a difficult time. You're not necessarily solving your patrons' problems, but you are helping them process them, think about them, and view them in different ways that eventually lead to their understanding of how to resolve them. There's something very beautiful and elegant in that, and if nothing else, Coffee Talk will get you to care about your customers and their troubles, even if it's just for a short time. If you'll forgive the obvious metaphor, this game is like a cup of good coffee, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, but satisfying to the last drop. Some games you love just because they're fun, and Crash Bandicoot 4: It's About Time is very fun. I didn't think Crash 4 would rank this high on the list when I finished it, but after some thought, I realized just how well put together this game is. Like many Crash games, challenge is placed at the forefront with a naturally scaling difficulty curve increasing the toughness as you move on, with no real standout difficulty spikes that mess with the flow. You're constantly adapting to the challenge the game is throwing at you, but at the same time, every level introduces something new at you that you need to learn how to overcome. Movement may feel stiff at first, but it's something you get used to after a couple of levels, and the circle that shows you where you're going to land is a godsend when you're attempting a tight platforming section. And while I'm not a huge fan of playing as Dr. Cortex, Tawna and Dingodile are both enjoyable characters that add an interesting spin on the base mechanics and complement Crash and Coco's gameplay. And for a relatively simple 3D platformer, there's so much to do in Crash 4 that you'll have plenty to keep you occupied. You may have heard about how ball-bustingly hard Crash 4 is to complete 100%, and just based on the amount of stuff you need to grab, plus how challenging it is to get it, it's safe to say that trying to grab everything is an absolutely insane venture. I do like the costumes you can unlock though, and the flashback tapes are incredibly fun, delivering a unique approach by having a bunch of boxes to break and no room for error if you decide to destroy every single one. Knowing how much stuff there was to collect in this game and how difficult it is to go for every collectible, I didn't even bother, but even if you're just trying to beat the game, Crash 4 is still fantastic. I'm not joking when I say this, but Crash 4 is one of the best 3D platformers I've played in recent memory, and if this is the start of a great new journey for Crash Bandicoot, then I think he's in good hands. Even though I have very little experience with the Crash series, I enjoyed playing this one so much that I'm really looking forward to seeing where gaming's favorite marsupial goes next. Okay, so technically you've been able to play this game since 2012, but the 1.0 version wasn't released until March 2020, so I say it still counts. Black Mesa is number 5. It's no secret that I love Half-Life. Hell, I'm sure some of you probably discovered me from my Half-Life series retrospective that you should watch after this video if you haven't already, hint hint. So you might think I have some bias towards putting a Half-Life game on this list, and well, you're absolutely right, but I can't give it to Half-Life Alyx because I haven't played it, so Black Mesa is the next best candidate. But don't get me wrong, I'm not listing Black Mesa here just because it's a Half-Life game, but because I was impressed with how it transformed one of my all-time favorite games into something truly new and original without changing too much to make it unrecognizable. Reimagining Half-Life for the Source engine maybe doesn't seem like a daunting task, but Crowbar Collective went above and beyond in preserving the spirit of Half-Life while also going in a new direction. Level design in particular has seen many significant changes to expand upon these classic areas and fine-tune aspects of Half-Life's maps that haven't aged the best, with Xen obviously being the most notable example. Almost the entirety of Xen is completely new, not only being way larger than the 1998 version, but also successfully implementing low-gravity based platforming on rough alien terrain, which any Half-Life player knows was not the original game's strong suit. Combat also feels improved, as Crowbar Collective made significant changes to enemy behavior and even added new abilities to some enemies to make them overall more aggressive and challenging to fight, a welcome change for people like me who have played the original so many times. You feel the pressure in these encounters, which is fitting since Gordon Freeman is a scientist thrust into a deadly situation and forced to survive. I personally think there's still merit in playing the original, but Black Mesa is an excellent modernization of a classic title that will certainly appeal to Half-Life fans and to newcomers. Not every change it makes is perfect, but Black Mesa absolutely meets and occasionally exceeds the high bar that the original set back in 1998. And that, in my mind, is the highest compliment Black Mesa can receive. Sometimes you know you're going to like a game as soon as you see the trailer for it, and Light Matter was one of those for me. It sold me as soon as I saw it because it was very obviously inspired by Portal, and I love Portal to death, but aside from that, Light Matter's mechanic of creating safe areas to walk on using light really intrigued me. And while some areas are rough around the edges, the core game is such a delightful puzzle game that it deserves your attention. For me, developers need to create puzzles that utilize their game's gimmick in ways that confound and surprise the player in wonderful ways, and Light Matter does this very well. Using light sources to build a path or activate objects leads to some enjoyable puzzles, and when the rooms later in the game require you to properly time actions and place objects in the right spot to avoid stepping into the shadows and dying, it can get very intense. Beyond the basic gameplay though, everything that ties the puzzles together is wonderful. The aesthetics are absolutely perfect, with simple visuals to represent puzzle objects, color choices that serve the gameplay in addition to looking nice, and a lovely ambient soundtrack. There's a rich atmosphere in Light Matter that really puts you into the mindset of being trapped inside a ruined science facility and forced to use your brain to solve puzzles and navigate through winding corridors thanks to the industrial sound design and sprawling linear levels. And although the story didn't interest me that much, it's still told very well, and the performance of David Bateson as Virgil is just the icing on top. It's thanks to Bateson's voice and emotional range that Virgil's lines are appropriately threatening and condescending, which is a perfect method of engaging the player and investing them in the current scenario, as you feel the consequences of dawdling too long solving these puzzles. In my review of this game, I said I was curious to see what Tunnel Vision Games would do next because of how good Light Matter is, especially considering it was their first effort. Since then, though, the team has announced that they would be going their separate ways, so that unfortunately isn't going to happen, which is a shame, but if Light Matter is Tunnel Vision's ultimate legacy, then I'd say that as short as it was, they definitely had a good run. I did not expect to love Doom 2016 as much as I did, but playing it for the first time this year in anticipation of its sequel was so much fun, and it made me wonder, how in the hell can Doom Eternal top this? And I don't know if it does, but it is such a damn good follow-up that it feels like that question doesn't even matter. Everything you loved in Doom 2016 is back, the intense gameplay, the bombastic soundtrack, and the visuals which combine several styles like the typical industrial and hellscape, as well as cities and medieval architecture. And there's still the flashiness and spectacle that you'd expect, especially in the glory kills, which still look and feel incredible to pull off. Even the story gets more attention in this game, as there are more cutscenes depicting the Doomslayer's quest to vanquish the demons invading Earth and running against the Night Sentinels and the Makers. The story still isn't the major focus, and for good reason, as having a complex narrative was never the point of Doom, and even though it's more important here, it's still not anything to write home about. Eternal takes the formula that Doom expertly created and expands it in all the right places, cranking up the weapon intensity, the enemy variety, the number of collectibles to find, and, of course, the difficulty. In Doom 2016, you could get away with a mindless approach, rushing through and blasting everything that moved, but I find it really interesting how much id Software actively tried to avoid this mindset in Eternal. Levels are much more complex and intricate this time around, with several branching paths and hidden goodies and more varied landscapes. And while you're still fully capable of dishing out the pain, the enemies are just as capable of doing the same to you if you're not careful, and Eternals sometimes absolutely bombard you with demons near the end of the game. You actually need to strategize during combat this time around, because just plowing through without thinking about who's taking which shots is a surefire way to get yourself slaughtered. Prioritizing your opponents and defeating or disabling bigger threats is essential, as is proper movement with your dash and grappling hook to avoid enemies and managing your ammo count for heavier weapons so you can take down tougher enemies more easily. Putting all of this into practice makes for a hectic and brutal gameplay loop that will no doubt challenge you, but makes for an incredibly absorbing and addictive game that gives you a constant thrill all the way through.
The portal is ready. We should leave immediately.
It was very hard to decide between my top 2 games of 2020, and while Ori and the Will of the Wisps held the top spot for a long time, it ultimately lost that battle. But don't misunderstand me, this is still an absolutely fantastic Metroidvania platformer that should not be ignored. Blind Forest was already a great adventure that needed better combat and a bit more polish, and that's exactly what Will of the Wisps provides. The combat has been significantly evolved from the button masher in Blind Forest, as Ori can now wield a variety of weapons that all have their strengths and weaknesses in combat applications. You actually have to put brain power into attacking enemies now by learning their attack patterns and mastering the art of moving and fighting at the same time, which is a sorely needed change after Blind Forest. Otherwise, the formula in Will of the Wisps is largely the same as its foundation, but with plenty of surface level changes that affect the dynamic of the game in ways that make it an even better experience. The Spirit Shard system lets you tailor Ori's abilities to suit your playstyle, and with the multitude of weapons and combat maneuvers available to you as well, there's never a point where the game becomes repetitive. There's also a lot more optional content in this game, like time trials and combat arenas, which I personally never found the need to beat, but it's there to add more substance to an already fantastic game. For me, it's the scale of the game that fascinates me the most. It's not that Will of the Wisps is very large, but thanks to the wonderful art direction and level design, it definitely feels like a grand, sprawling world. Every area is interconnected with each other in ways that feel organic, with no awkward room transitions bridging the gaps and instead pushing you through platforming-heavy intermediate areas between the main locations. The artists beautifully rendered the game's 3D objects, backgrounds, and environments to give it a 2D-esque art style that looks ripped right out of a painting, and the color palettes for each area are absolutely sublime. And every story segment brilliantly communicates the feelings of the characters through its typically dialogue-free cutscenes, putting you into Ori's shoes and highlighting the curiosity, awe, and fear of encountering a world where everything is large and potentially life-threatening. All of this leads to perhaps the most engrossing world I've traveled through in a platformer, perhaps even video games in general, and though it may not be very large on the surface, playing deeper into it gives it a sense of size that almost seems unreal. The game's director, Thomas Mahler, stated during development that Will of the Wisps would be to Blind Forest what Super Mario Bros. 3 was to the original Super Mario Bros., and they certainly hit that on the head. It's a bigger game than its predecessor, but one that's wholly enjoyable all the way through, and any problems it has are minor, especially when the journey feels so magical to watch unfold. And my pick for the best game of 2020 is Ghost of Tsushima. It's not uncommon for a game to exceed my expectations, but it's pretty rare when one completely blows my expectations out of the water. When I began to play Ghost of Tsushima, I expected that it would be a solid title but not extraordinary, and for a time, it was exactly that. But when everything comes together with the gameplay, story, and world building in the second half, Ghost transforms into something truly remarkable that rises above the sum of its parts. The combat isn't just about mashing buttons to swing your sword, it requires tactics and timing by switching up your stance to be more effective against specific types of enemies, knowing what attacks can be parried and what must be dodged, and effectively utilizing your secondary items. Getting a good rhythm during a battle is such a good feeling, and that's enhanced when you activate Ghost Mode and slaughter your enemies. Even the stealth sections are fun because the missions are designed in ways that encourage stealth without forcing you to use it, with a balance between open areas and closed off hallways and choke points. All of this is compounded by a stellar system of exploration that makes traveling rewarding even when you're not looking for a specific objective. Not only is the setting absolutely beautiful, especially in the Kamiagata region, but the lack of objective markers until you get close to your destination makes it important to actually observe and analyze your surroundings as the wind guides you to where you need to go. But what unifies the game together is the story, which is masterfully crafted and told in a beautiful manner, taking heavy inspirations from the samurai films of Akira Kurosawa in its themes, writing, and composition. You see Jin Sakai's transformation from an honorable samurai who loyally serves his uncle Lord Shimura to a vigilante willing to break his sense of honor to save the people of Tsushima from the invading Mongols. The game shows Jin's inner conflict as he adopts tactics which he believes are necessary to fight the Mongols but that go against the samurai code. All throughout the game, the story teases you with the thread that maybe there's a chance Jin can travel down both paths and live at peace with everyone, even when you know deep inside that it's not possible. Inevitably, this leads to some heart-pounding and gut-wrenching moments later in the game when all the conflicts come to a head, especially with Jin's relationship with Yuna and Taka, Lady Masako, and Lord Shimura. Obviously, I'm not gonna spoil anything, but especially in the third act, the narrative buckles down on the strength of its characters and pushes them to the breaking point, and you're invested every step of the way. The final story mission, which I'm not showing here, sees Jin finally confront the emotional weight that's been holding him down through the entire game, leading to a spectacular climax to a spectacular journey. It may take a while for the game to really get going, but once it does, it becomes a marvelous adventure that I didn't want to see end, and yet I felt completely satisfied when it did. So that wraps up my top 10 games of 2020 video. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on all these games, and maybe I've even inspired you to pick some of these titles up and give them a whirl. This was a fun list to put together, and I'm considering making this a yearly tradition, so tune in next January where I cover my favorite games of 2021. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in February with even more opinions and analysis on video games. Bye everybody!